This is going to be a super simplified understanding of politics as it relates to our modern political sort of discourse. Watch this, okay? Now, I am going to come in with an arrow from the top of the screen. See that? Do you know what this arrow is? Okay? This arrow right here is feudalism. And everything that came with it. No, I forgot an S. Feudalism. I'm going to do feudalism plus. See? Feudalism and everything that came with it. Now, listen up. History and politics and political thought, these are really complicated things. And for me to distill this down to like a very basic 101, this does a disservice to the research of many people and to many, frankly, civilizations. But for the purposes of understanding modern political discourse, I think this is going to be pretty helpful. Okay? Now, feudalism. What is it? Well, feudalism is an economic system by which land is controlled by lords, or whatever the civilization wants to call them, and that land is worked by the serfs, and usually the lords take a massive portion of the resources, proceeds, and output, and they are subsequently taxed by the monarch. And there are a billion variations, okay? But what's most important to us is that in the time that feudalism was practiced in Europe, there were certain political attitudes going around that trended towards anti-egalitarian, anti-democratic thought. You see, at the time, it was believed that monarchs, for the most part, were appointed by God. That the royal bloodline of a monarchy they weren't just special, they weren't just smart or enlightened or educated. They were literally divinely chosen by gods to sit upon the throne and rule over their kingdom. Subsequently, it was believed that while certain members of a society were capable of engaging with politics, these were usually nobles, aristocrats, scholars. What? Oh, I thought she was getting my attention. While these people could engage with political thought, usually because they knew how to read and write, the vast majority of people, the peasantry, were not considered to be political agents. It was not believed that, like your average farmer or your average blacksmith, not only are these people not politically represented, they weren't even political agents. They were just essentially dumb animals to be moved about like pawns on a chessboard in the service of the motivations of actual political agents. And who could blame them for thinking that way? The average peasant back then must have been dumb as bricks, couldn't read, couldn't write, no education, formal or otherwise. The only thing they were trained to do was the task that they needed to give goods to the Lord so they could earn enough to eat. That's it. That was their entire life. And then, due to an increase in the wealth funneled in from the imperialist empires of Europe, there was a growing middle class of merchants, scholars, and students, and those people grew in power with time, and eventually their power manifested in what we now call something I'm probably not going to be able to fit in this text box. The Enlightenment! My friends, it is impossible to overstate the extent to which the Enlightenment and the values that came with it I know there's a text tool, guys. I like drawing it. It is impossible to overstate the extent to which the Enlightenment affected political, civic, and philosophical discourse. So many ideas. out of the fucking ether. Not really. There were long-standing historical and philosophical precedents for all of these ideas and civilizations elsewhere in the world that had already built upon them. But for the purposes of this discussion, the Enlightenment. Wow. Whoo boy, how do we even begin? Democracy. Hey, you. Peasant. You exist in this kingdom, don't you? You're affected by its laws. Shouldn't you have a say in those laws? What? Self-determination. Hey, freedom. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to more or less do whatever you want without the imposition of other people's rules, so long as you're not violating on the freedoms of free trade. Hey, instead of you being obligated to give up your resources to the nobles and lords and shit so they can make profit off of it and do what they want with it, what if people could trade freely, which would allow them to moderate and make decisions with their own wealth and production? Incredible. That would lead to more individual freedom. Whoa. What about republicanism? The idea that rather than having every individual human being in a society individually determining their own political future, they consolidate their political strength into representative political officials who will then vote in their interests at the Capitol. Amazing! It's amazing! It's so amazing! Incredible! Over the course of just a few decades, these ideas, which had existed in the past, of course, suddenly reached a fucking breaking point. They exploded into the scene. Whereas just 50 years ago, scholars at Oxford and such and such, all the higher educational institutions, they would talk about Machiavellian theory. They would talk about divine right to rule. They would talk about how the orchestrations of the political upper class were necessary in order to keep the subservient peasants and land. None of that shit anymore. Kablam! We got what we now refer to broadly as Enlightenment era thinking, aka, and you're gonna remember this term, liberalism. This is liberalism right here. This is what it means truly to be a classical liberal. These are liberal values: freedom, free association, free trade, democracy, republicanism. These things, it was incredible. And most people today derive their values from the Enlightenment. It's pretty cool. I mean, we got a lot from that, you know? Like, wow.